One day, Peppa found an old, dusty book on the bookshelf at home. The cover read, "Fairy Tale World," in shimmering golden letters. Curious, she opened the book and started flipping through its colorful pages. As she turned the pages, a magical light emerged from the book, and suddenly, Peppa found herself in a completely different place. Looking around, she saw endless flower fields, a sparkling sky, and tiny shimmering fairy dust floating everywhere. To her amazement, Peppa realized she had wings. She was now a fairy. When she flapped her wings, she could soar into the air and see the magical world from above. "This is amazing!" Peppa exclaimed with joy, after flying around for a bit. Peppa came across a group of fairies sitting by a magical pond. The leader of the fairies, Lila, approached her and began to speak. "Welcome, Peppa. This is the fairy tale world. But our kingdom is in danger. An evil wizard has trapped our queen, Fairy Glimmer, in a magical tower and has begun stealing the kingdom's colors. Everything is starting to fade, and we need your help." Peppa bravely stepped forward and said, "Don't worry. I will help you." The fairies gave Peppa a magical map that showed the locations of 3 enchanted stones hidden in different parts of the kingdom. These stones were needed to restore the kingdom's former glory. Peppa flew to the Flower Valley first. It had once been full of colorful blooms, but now the flowers were withered and lifeless. In the middle of the valley, a queen bee was buzzing sadly. "The flower stone was taken by a giant and is now hidden in his cave," said the bee. Peppa went to the cave and found the giant. The giant wasn't evil, he was just lonely and loved the glow of the flower stone. Peppa talked to him kindly and convinced him to return the stone. Grateful for Peppa's kindness, the giant gifted her a glowing flower crown. Next, Peppa followed the map to Rainbow Falls. But here, all the colors of the rainbow had completely disappeared. At the top of the falls, a group of unhappy water fairies sat. When Peppa spoke to them, she learned that the color stone had been taken by the evil wizard and hidden among the clouds. Peppa, with the help of the fairies, created a magical path to reach the clouds. Among the clouds, she found the color stone and brought it back to the waterfall. As soon as she placed the stone back in its rightful spot, the colors of the rainbow instantly returned, and all the fairies began to dance with joy. Finally, Peppa traveled to the starry forest. This was a place filled with trees that glowed like stars throughout the night. But now the lights had completely faded. Deep within the forest, Peppa discovered that the stone was hidden in a web spun by a giant spider. Peppa calmed the spider by singing to it and explained how important the stone was for the forest. The spider agreed to return the stone, and when it was put back in its place, the forest began to shine brightly once more. With all 3 stones collected, Peppa and the fairies flew to the magical tower. Using the power of the stones, they broke the evil wizard's spell, and Queen Glimmer was freed. The queen thanked Peppa and declared her an honorary member of the fairy kingdom. Peppa flapped her wings one last time to bid farewell to the fairy tale world. In a flash, she was back in her room, sitting in front of the magical book. She closed the book and smiled, saying, "What an amazing adventure!" Even after returning to her room, the excitement of her adventure filled Peppa's heart. She picked up the book and thought about opening it again but decided to wait. "Maybe another day," she whispered. Still, the beauty of the fairy tale world stayed fresh in her mind. The next morning, Peppa couldn't wait to tell her friends about what had happened. When she arrived at preschool, she eagerly gathered Susie Sheep, Danny Dog, and her other friends. "Friends, I experienced something incredible yesterday," she exclaimed. Everyone gathered around her with curiosity. Peppa began to tell them about finding the magical book and her adventure in the fairy tale world. My wings were there, and I could fly. I had to find 3 magical stones to save the kingdom. I went to Flower Valley, Rainbow Falls, and the Starry Forest. Peppa continued. Susie excitedly asked, Really? Can you show me that book, Peppa? Of course. Maybe you can visit the fairy tale world too, Peppa said, her eyes sparkling. That evening, after returning from school, Peppa decided to open the book again. But this time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Hidden between the pages was a small envelope. On the envelope, it said, A special mission for Peppa. Peppa eagerly opened the envelope. Inside, there was a tiny map and a note. Dear Peppa, there are still many secrets to be discovered in the fairy tale world. This map will lead you to another adventure. Prepare your wings and don't forget the fairy dust. With love, Queen Glimmer. Peppa immediately reopened the book and let the magical light pull her inside again. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a completely different place. This time, she was standing in front of a huge, enchanting castle, bigger than anything she had ever seen before. The castle had towers reaching up to the sky and windows that shimmered with light. As Peppa walked toward the castle gates, she was greeted by a moon fairy. Her name was Luna, and she was thrilled to meet Peppa. Luna explained the new mission to her. The castle has been under a mysterious curse for a long time. We can break the curse using the power of the moonstone. But the stone is hidden deep in the heart forest. Will you help us, Peppa? Without hesitation, Peppa said, Of course I will. Together with Luna, they passed through a magical portal and entered the heart forest. The forest was filled with giant trees, and each tree was adorned with heart-shaped leaves. However, the forest was covered in mist that made the journey difficult. As Peppa advanced through the forest, she encountered a friendly owl. The owl wanted to teach Peppa a special song to help her pass through the mist. Following the owl's melody, Peppa and Luna finally reached the place where the moonstone was hidden. The stone was glowing in the center of a pond, shimmering on the water's surface. But taking the stone wasn't easy. A giant water dragon, the guardian of the pond, protected the stone. Peppa spoke kindly to the dragon to calm it, and with Luna's help, she offered the dragon a beautiful star wreath. The dragon responded to Peppa's gentle approach and handed over the moonstone to them. Peppa and Luna returned to the castle with the moonstone. When they placed the stone on a magical altar in the center of the castle, a burst of light occurred. The curse was lifted instantly, and the castle regained its former glory. Queen Glimmer thanked Peppa and gifted her a fairy wand. This wand officially made Peppa a guardian of the fairy tale world. Once again, Peppa returned home from the fairy tale world. This adventure had shown her once more that courage and friendship always prevail. Now, whenever she looked at her book, she knew she was ready for a new adventure. After returning home, Peppa felt braver and happier than ever. The fairy wand stood in a special corner of her room. Although she had returned from the fairy tale world, Peppa still felt deep inside that a new adventure was waiting for her. One morning, when Peppa woke up, she noticed her fairy wand was glowing faintly. She immediately went over to it and took it in her hand. The wand began to speak in a gentle voice. Peppa, the kingdom calls you once again. This time, for a very special mission. Without hesitation, Peppa said, I'm ready right now. The wand glowed brightly and took her back to the fairy tale world. This time, Peppa found herself on a vast beach under a sky filled with stars. As Peppa walked along the shore, a star fell from the sky and landed in front of her. From inside the star, a tiny, sparkling fairy emerged. This fairy explained that the Shadow Princess was threatening the kingdom. The Shadow Princess was using dark powers to try to extinguish the light of the fairy tale world. "Peppa, only you can stop her plans," said the tiny fairy. Peppa, feeling a bit anxious, but still brave, said, "I accept the mission." To find the Shadow Princess, Peppa had to go to the darkest corner of the fairy tale world, the Shadow Realm. Along the way, Luna and Lila, who Peppa had met on previous adventures, joined her. Together, they followed a magical light map to the entrance of the Shadow Realm. At the entrance, they were met by a giant door. On the door were the words, "Only those who carry true courage in their hearts can pass through this realm." Remembering the courage in her heart, Peppa touched the door, and it slowly opened. The Shadow Realm was unlike anything Peppa had ever seen. The sky had turned black, and the flowers on the ground had withered. However, Luna and Lila encouraged Peppa. "Remember, light always conquers darkness." Peppa and her friends, after a long journey, finally reached the Shadow Princess's throne. The princess wore a long black cloak, and her eyes glowed with a cold light. "Peppa, why have you come here?" asked the Shadow Princess in a mocking tone. Peppa, courageously, said, "I'm here to bring back the light of the fairy tale world." The Shadow Princess, using her dark powers, created a storm, but Peppa, with the help of her wand and friends, formed a glowing light shield. Peppa suggested to the Shadow Princess to be friends instead of fighting with darkness. "We all feel lonely sometimes," Peppa said. "But friendship is the strongest source of light." These words softened the Shadow Princess's heart. Thanks to Peppa's friendly approach, the princess gave up her dark powers, and the fairy tale world was once again filled with light. The princess, thanking Peppa, gave her a star crystal. This crystal combined with Peppa's fairy wand, making it even stronger. Peppa returned to the kingdom, where she was once again welcomed with celebrations. Queen Glimmer declared that thanks to Peppa's courage and friendship, the fairy tale world was now completely safe. Peppa placed the star crystal in a special spot in her room, knowing she was ready for a new adventure. Every night, as she went to bed, she looked at the stars in the sky and remembered her friends in the fairy tale world. Peppa's adventures in the fairy tale world weren't over. Who knows, maybe one day she would be called again for a new adventure. With her courage and love, Peppa was always ready. After returning from the fairy tale world, Peppa noticed that the star crystal faintly glowed every time she returned to her room. This glow seemed like a sign of a new adventure waiting for her. As the days passed, Peppa began to miss her friends in the fairy tale world more and more. She often daydreamed about the moments she had shared with Luna and Lila. One evening, Peppa sat down at her desk to examine the crystal. The moment she touched it, a light erupted from the crystal, filling her room. This time, the crystal birthed a tiny, star-shaped magical creature. The star creature began to speak. "Peppa, it's so good to see you. My name is Stella. I've brought you a message from the fairy tale world." Peppa, curious, asked, "What message?" Stella's bright eyes sparkled. "Queen Glimmer invites you back to the fairy tale world. But this time, not just as a hero, but as the guide of the fairy tale world. A new adventure awaits you." Peppa immediately accepted. The crystal began to glow once again, and Peppa found herself in the fairy tale world once more. This time, it was a different place, the Star Garden. The garden was filled with stars falling from the sky, and each star represented a wish. Luna and Lila were waiting to greet Peppa. "Peppa, it's so nice to see you. Luna said joyfully, "Queen Glimmer has called you for a very important mission," added Lila. The mission was to awaken an ancient guardian in the Star Garden. This guardian was a phoenix who had protected the garden for years. However, the bird had fallen into a deep sleep for many years. Queen Glimmer explained that the magic of the Star Garden had started to fade, and only the phoenix could renew this magic. Peppa, Luna, and Lila set off towards the rising peak, where the phoenix's nest was located. Reaching the peak wasn't easy. The paths were covered with magical clouds, and these clouds only parted when they heard the correct melody. With Stella's guidance, Peppa and her friends discovered the melody and managed to pass through the clouds. When they reached the nest, Peppa saw the phoenix. The bird was covered in golden and red feathers, but it seemed like its magic had weakened. To awaken the bird, Peppa needed to make a wish from the courage in her heart. Peppa closed her eyes and whispered her wish: "May the light of the fairy tale world always shine, and may everyone learn to protect the beauty of this world." With this wish, the phoenix opened its eyes. As it flapped its wings, it soared into the sky, and the magical lights surrounding it revitalized the Star Garden. Queen Glimmer held a grand festival to celebrate Peppa and her friends. The Star Garden was filled with shining stars and magical lights. During the festival, everyone applauded Peppa's courage and love. Queen Glimmer gave Peppa a star crown and declared her the honorary guardian of the fairy tale world. As Peppa danced with her friends, she once again realized how special this world was. She thought to herself, "I want to come back here forever." When Peppa returned to her world, the star crystal appeared even brighter. Now, before falling asleep every night, she thought about her adventures. And she knew she would be called again one day. Because the fairy tale world would always shine brighter with Peppa's love and courage, Peppa's story was not over. There were endless adventures as bright as the stars and as magical as fairy tales waiting for her one day to begin.